Forward to your questions.
Thank you to our witnesses, and we'll go to Senator Poirier.
I just have a couple of questions, not very long, but my first one is for Ms. Fuller. In your speaking notes, one of your suggested improvements is to ensure the goal is to rebuild stocks to healthy levels. Just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on this suggestion for us.
Sure. So in the Department of Fisheries and Ocean Sustainable Fisheries Framework, there's guidance on rebuilding that includes a precautionary approach framework. And that precautionary approach framework has stocks in 3 zones. One is critical, not good, red. Cautious is yellow, green is healthy. And so our concern in Section 6 right now is that it's to rebuild it just above the critical zone, which is just above, right? Which means that we don't know that a stock could actually continue to rebuild unless the goal is actually to get it to healthy. And an example, cod fishery was opened in 1998 in Newfoundland, and fishing increased fairly quickly, fairly high fishing levels when it started to rebound after the initial collapse. And now it went back down again quite quickly. So we'd like to make sure that there's a longer term view to rebuilding those stocks. And I am very mindful that not all stocks can be rebuilt at the same time and together, but that we should aim for healthy.
Okay, great, thanks. The next question is open to anyone that feels that they would like to answer. And again, it's the minister appeared before the committee on April the 2nd, and the Canadian Coast Guard, and they explained that there was $107.4 million over 5 years that had been announced in the fall economic statement, and that a further $17.6 million per year was also announced on an ongoing basis, and these funds were committed to help implement the Fisheries Act. I just want to know, in your view, are the proposed funds sufficient to implement the Fisheries Act, as far as you're concerned? You can all go if you want to.
We'll start with Mr. Bates.
Sure, it's a lot of money. Historically, as an addition to the department, some of that money is directed to very important projects. The proposals we're recommending won't cost much money at all, so would have a negligible impact on any of that. I guess it's hard to say without knowing their budget intimately whether that would be enough, but I think as a starting spot, that's pretty good.
Okay.
The only comment I would have is that some of that funds goes towards the Great Lakes. It's not all spent on the west and the east coast, where a bulk of DFO work is. That there needs to be some attention on what's happening in the Great Lakes to preserve and protect them.
And I would just say it's a significant investment. I think we've seen reinvestment in DFO science and management, and there's a lot of work to be done in rebuilding plans. I will say, however, that some of the hard work doesn't cost money. It's decision-making that is hard. And so I think that money needs to be matched with difficult decisions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Poirier. Senator Griffin.
Chair. My question is for Mr. Bates. Third-party involvement is already in place in a number of provinces, and I'm sure you're aware of that, so that there would be no net loss of fisheries habitat in freshwater fisheries. And for instance, that came into place in Prince Edward Island when I was a deputy minister there, and the very enlightened policy was brought into place to have no net loss of wetland habitat, and that where it couldn't be avoided altogether and had to be impacted, the proponent could pay some in lieu. But the Prince Edward Island government frequently contracts with Ducks Unlimited to do the actual work, since they're the experts and the proponent is not. Are you aware of that elsewhere in Canada?
Offsetting for wetland habitat, I believe, exists in a couple of other places on the prairies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't know of other places.
I mean, there's certainly there are certainly different types of habitat banking for different types of habitats that people have piloted in the provinces, and the federal DFO itself has a short list of maybe 10 things that you could call habitat banks that it's created over the years. So it is something that's been happening in Canada in a limited extent, and obviously we think it's good for the environment and for wildlife and for our fish. So we're here proposing that the bill allow for more of that to happen. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Boson. Senator Munson.
For being here. There's been a long day of testimony. I'll get into an Indigenous question in a moment, but there's a specific one that we have in our brief, which is the Chemical Corporation, in a brief provided to this committee, explains that including water flow into the definition of fish habitat potentially represents the most significant expansion of the definition of fish habitat in the history of the Act. And that brief also states that, quote, the proposed amendment will not have a corresponding environmental benefit or increase the protection of fish and habitat beyond simply serving as an overall deterrent to development. Do you agree with this statement?
I can take that. I know that there's been some concern about some industry associations and interests on the flow provision because it is new. I will also say that we all, I think, can agree that regulating water flows and being able to have some control over that's extremely important in order to achieve other aspects of the Act. And I think that there has been quite a bit of genuine outreach between environmental organizations and industry associations to try and work out some of the concerns in the regulations and the codes of practice. But, water flowing over fish is probably the most vital piece of habitat that fish need. So having the department have at least, the jurisdiction, have that in the definition is quite important. And I would say DFO's own scientists, there's a CSAS report from, I can't recall which year, but DFO's own scientists recommend that flow is quite important to the health of fish at various different life history stages. Doesn't mean every puddle.
Right. Okay. No, I just wanted to get some clarification, and a better understanding to the to you folks, Canadian Wildlife. Could you tell me here, you talked about recommendation, expand the proposed habitat banking system to enable third parties to participate. Who are the third parties? How does that work?
It could be a private company. It could be a Indigenous peoples organization. Could be a conservation organization as well.
Okay. And the third question I have deals with, we heard the Indigenous testimony just before you folks. What did you think of that when you see the discrepancies in both sides of the country, that there seems to be a sense of satisfaction after Senator Christmas talked about serious court cases and determination to build a fishing industry, and then you talk, I can't believe I heard the word starving people, but there are people who are not with proper nutrition, and others along the West Coast who are not getting their fair share of what is still wealthy in the sea. What did you make of that when you heard that kind of testimony? Everybody wants this act, it seems to me. I don't know, maybe there are a few who don't, and it is progress, but it seems to me when it comes to 2019 that we have failed. We have failed the West Coast Indigenous people and in the North.
My impression was that it was not so much the Act or the previous Act even, but the implementation and some local issues that were the heart of the problem that was discussed earlier. I think this Act is excellent in the way it details involvement with the First Nations. That's certainly a direction we have taken as an organisation, and it's very rewarding.
Ms. Fuller?
I would say we have failed our Indigenous peoples across this country in numerous ways, and access to fish and food, social and ceremonial fisheries is incredibly important. And the court case decisions both on the West Coast and the East Coast have started to deal with some of that access issues, but we're a long way from getting to the right place on that. And I think the key is trust, and we heard that earlier, and relationships, and doing that at a local level or a fisheries based level. And my hope is that this act will start to enable the department to do that, and enable Indigenous communities to have some power in that. And we have a long road to a reconciliation, and this bill, I think, provides for some of that, and puts things in law that are really mostly court case decisions at this point.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Munson. Senator Petitclerc.
Yes, Mr. President. Thank you all for your presentation. I have a question that is a little broad, but just to help me and hopefully others with some perspective. Mr. Bates, you mentioned when you talked about the third-party fish habitat banking and offset payments, you mentioned international examples like Australia and Germany, and so I kind of wanted to hear a little more about what is it that they do. Is it similar to what could be or what you're proposing for an amendment and could be implemented in this bill? And is it successful? Is it working well? So I don't know, like maybe just a little more information on that. And maybe more as a general question, I'm interested in knowing, and Madame Fuller, you did mention that, it's about time that we improve the Fisheries Act. And I wanted to have some perspective on where we sit on the international level in that kind, like, is this act bringing us to being leader or not, or just to give me a bit of perspective. So I don't know if you want to start specific and then.
Sure. I just looked at a list a few days ago that there are some 158 countries with offsetting provisions in their acts. There are there are far fewer that have habitat banking provisions, and so those offsetting provisions, some are active, where they have regulations and programs and support. Some are not. Some are successful. Some are not. Typically, the ones that have been around longer are more successful, because they're active. People are working at them and constantly refining them. The examples we used in my statement were ones with actual habitat banks, and ones with a bit of history, and ones that were countries that were a little bit comparable. United States, Germany, others, and where they have very successful programs. The implications of not doing things like this are that, the taxpayer gets stuck with the bill eventually, having to pay these things, pay for restoration. An extreme example of that is Anhui province in China, where my daughter is from. They, a couple of years ago, invested $100 billion over 8 months in one river to help begin to restore it. So those are the kinds of consequences at the extreme end when these things are not dealt with upfront proactively.
Thank you. Did you want to?
Yeah, I think just briefly on this bringing Canada closer to having good fisheries laws, absolutely. The rebuilding provisions, other countries who are developed fishing nations that we talk to in international fishing negotiations, the U.S., Norway, New Zealand, Australia, all have rebuilding provisions. So it's really good check for Canada. I would say also the factors that need to be considered, science-based decision-making, ecosystem approach, precautionary approach, Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, socioeconomics, those are all pieces of good fisheries management that Canada, signed on to UN agreements or FAO guidelines on. Having those in our act brings us again closer. So yes, I would say absolutely brings us closer to having a good fisheries act we can be proud of. The proof is always in the pudding and the implementation, but this is a good start.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Petitclerc. Senator Christmas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I have a question for each of you. I'll start with Ms. Fuller. I was quite intrigued by that report that you showed earlier, the fish stock report, and it didn't strike me until you mentioned it, that there is nothing in C-68 that requires a report or annual report on fish stocks. Is that correct?
Section 42.1 does require, 42.1 bracket 1 does require a report on habitat and implementation of the act to Parliament, but it's not very specific to Section 6. Yeah. So which stocks are in which condition and which are being rebuilt. And I think, I know Oceana, actually I have a copy of Oceana's report. I mean, right now, the best accounting for where we are in Canada is done by an NGO, right? For a public resource. So I would say, DFO does now make the information publicly available. I think a bit of funding for a good graphic designer could get us a report quite similar to this. The information is there. It just hasn't been done before, and it's not actually required, but I do think, given the importance of fish and fish habitat to Canadians, Canadians and the public knowing where we are, once we've implemented this act, how do we tell in 20 years if we've been successful? Do we no longer have 40 stocks that are endangered and threatened in Atlantic Canada? We only have 20. How is that being, reported to Canadians and to Parliament over time? And so I think it would be a small but important amendment that DFO was already sort of doing, but give some clarity to it and some transparency and accountability to the public.
So, so I noticed other pieces of federal legislation require some degree of annual reports for different areas of federal responsibility. So it just strikes me that having an annual report on the state of fish stocks makes sense to me.
Yeah, and so right now some of the data is included in the Sustainable Development Report, Development Report, but it's kind of strange because then it's Environment Canada and Climate Change Canada reporting out on fish and not DFO actually including that. And so it's, fishermen aren't going to look at, most coastal communities won't look at that Sustainable Development Report to see how things are going. They want to see what DFO is doing. So
could I ask for your assistance in trying to come up with something that makes it clear and easy and accountable to Canadians and how our fish stocks. For me, that's one of the most exciting parts of Bill C-68 is the rebuilding of depleted fish stocks. So I really would like to see that.
Happy to help.
Mr. Kindersley, I appreciate your commentary on open net fish pens. One of the criticisms I've heard over the years about open net fish pens, not so much about them, but the alternative of doing closed systems was that it was the capital cost of doing a closed net aquacultural system is considerably higher than an open net system. Is that your view as well, or do you share a different idea on that?
Yes, that is largely correct. And I think this is an industry that's matured because a lot of these new technologies have now been proven up financially. And that was the key element that was missing perhaps in the past 20 years or so. So once they can be shown to be operated profitably, they should attract the capital that's needed to make them work, or to expand that part of the industry. And really I believe that is where the growth comes from. There are other problems with open net fish farms, such as they are usually a long distance from their markets, and then you have to truck them to market, and then you're burning fossil fuels to do that. That's not a good thing. I mean, if we can avoid it, I mean, the big advantage of land-based facilities is you can locate them near your market, and you don't have those big transport costs. Also, some of the aquaponics developments where they're growing, vegetables or marijuana together with the fish. These are, you're making use of the phosphorus that's coming, from the fish feces. you're recycling it on the spot into growing something that humans can eat. These actually, I think that really is the direction this industry is going, and those are more profitable because they have two or more sources of revenue. So the big problem with the open net fish farms in Georgian Bay and the North Channel is that they are very small operations. They do not have access to capital of any size. They're mainly family-owned businesses, and they're using basically antiquated technology, which is not sustainable. So we need more money to come into this industry. We need other people to get involved with better technology, better engineers, better scientists. This is a huge growth opportunity. It's terribly important that we have a good aquaculture industry. We must stop fishing for wild fish, commercially as much as possible. I mean, I know a lot of lives depend on that in various areas, but really that is not sustainable on a global basis. We're going to run out of fish.
So do we have any examples here of the Canadian industry, aquaculture industry, embracing the land-based systems?
Oh, yes, it's happening. Yes. Sorry, there are quite a lot of examples, and there's a lot of new technologies that have emerged recently.
Great.
So I mean, to try and go into it now, I think it would take too long. But yeah, I mean, the ones that I think are the best are the aquaponics, where they're growing plants on the spot. Otherwise, they've got to dispose of the polluted water from these fish operations, and that seems to be crazy when you can expand the facility to grow something.
Mr. Brown, I had cut you off. You wanted to answer a question I asked Ms. Fuller.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that it doesn't require a report on fish habitat, status of fish habitat either. So in 2009, the Auditor General did point out in their review of the fish habitat provisions that DFO didn't actually know what the state of fish habitat was in Canada and therefore could not manage it or report on whether they had benefited or caused a decline in fish habitat over time. So that is not in the Act right now.
Mr. Bates, the whole concept of third-party habitat banking obviously is very intriguing, and I've taken liberty to bounce that idea off other people just to see what they thought. And one of the comments I received back sort of puzzled me, and maybe was a bogus comment perhaps. But one of the comments I received was third-party habitat banking would more easily fall within provincial jurisdictions rather than federal jurisdictions, because most land is provincially owned. How would you respond to that?
Well, for fish habitat, it is DFO's jurisdiction. And so to implement habitat banking for aquatic areas, DFO would have to be involved.
So
for
even
the terrestrial areas, that makes sense maybe for provinces.
So even though the land is owned by the province, I understand the fish habitat responsibility is a federal response. I understand that. But when it comes to land ownership, would that create a gray area with federal provincial jurisdictions, or?
I can't see one.
I mean, DFO's already implemented habitat banks on provincial lands. So it didn't when they did it back then. Perhaps it could somehow, but certainly the province has ownership of the jurisdiction over sort of the bottom of lakes and rivers, but the federal government has jurisdiction over fish habitat, and I think it's pretty clear.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I just want to say that I can only speak to wetlands in the Great Lakes, and particularly Georgian Bay, which has the most important wetlands in the Great Lakes by a long margin. A couple of things. First of all, if you're doing any kind of offsetting, you have to be very, very careful, particularly with wetlands, because the quality of the wetland varies enormously. And if you're creating a new wetland, which is actually feasible, the quality will be pretty low compared to an established one. And I can't speak to other kind of fish banks, but I imagine that could be the case with them as well. So be cautious on this type of policy is what I would urge. But in terms of ownership for the wetlands in the Georgian Bay water basin, for instance, I mean, some of it is federally owned because they own the ground underneath the water. But when you move inland, and a lot of those wetlands are very important, I suspect, well, the ownership is all over the shop. I mean, you've got conservation authorities, you've got Crown land, which is administered by the Ontario government, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a mixed bag. So, what?
Thank you, Senator Christmas. Senator Bosson.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just a bit of follow-up. I'm curious about the habitat banks. Back to that, it's kind of an interesting topic. And I was just wondering, in the jurisdictions that do that, and you say we do it a little bit in Canada now, is there a big infrastructure of administration to make sure that the bank is sort of actually equalized, that the habitat taken and the habitat in balance on the other side of the equation is even or fair? And who would be the person or the group that would ensure that you're getting the right remediation for the right sort of destruction, if I can use that word, for in a habitat bank situation, or when a company perhaps even buys an interest? Yeah.
I mean, the key, we're just figuring out who, I've been looking at the regulations a little more than Rick, but any environmental consultant or habitat banking group, say in the United States or in Australia, would tell you that the only way that this works is if you have a strong regulator. So if you have no one regulating the habitat and they don't have a framework for how to regulate it, you cannot have habitat banking. So you're exactly right. You need a regulator that's behind doing this and puts the framework in place to get it right. But is that a massive bureaucracy of people to check every credit? It hasn't been in some countries. I mean, it takes people to decide on how you're going to decide on equivalency of credits, but you can build that on work that's been done in other countries. And I would just add that, a bit of the legacy of Canada's particular way of protecting fish habitat is that we have some of the best fish habitat scientists in the entire world. We publish the main journal in the world on this kind of thing, and we have a history of figuring out how to do this. So I think Canada is very much up to the task, where everyone looks to us for this kind of information. So it would take, it needs to be resourced to create a system and a framework for creating the banking provisions. But it doesn't involve a lot of, if you're thinking of a new inspectors and all kinds of sort of on the ground, hundreds of people and staff. That's not the way it's been run in other countries. It's really the regulator putting the framework in place, and then private sector or NGOs or other individuals, the actors, fitting into the framework and getting the work done, if that makes sense.
Great. No, it does. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bosson. And Senator Duffy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses. Fascinating information, and it's very helpful to us. Ms. Fuller, I have a question for you, because I was looking at your brief, and you talk about species at risk. We have a proposal in Atlantic Canada on the Northumberland Strait, and you're a maritimer, by Northern Pulp to change the way they operate and, in fact, run a pipe into Northumberland Strait in a very rich fishing area, through which they propose to pump something like 80,000 liters a day of what is so far still undesignated effluent. In other words, they can't tell us what's in it. So here's my question. The Minister of Fisheries was here. We raised this question out of concern, which is widely felt through the 3 maritime provinces by people in the fishing industry, that the damage that this pipe might do to the fish stocks, to the lobster in particular, would be horrendous. And the answer back from DFO seems to be, when you pull away the verbiage, that they can't jump into this until after there is damage. That right now it's in the hands of environment and climate change, who will look at this and consider. Now, the province, there is no federal environmental assessment because the province still has it. We are hoping that there will be a federal environmental assessment. But even if environment and climate change got in, DFO would take a back seat because they only get involved after the damage has been done. It seems to me that that's retrograde or backwards thinking. And it seems to me that while we want to get this bill through because the industry needs revitalization after 100 years and all of the frustrations you've had in the past, it seems to me if we don't find some way to address this, we are not finishing the job we should be doing. Does anybody have any comment on that?
So I'm very familiar with the Northern Pulp Pipe. There's a few things. Number one, within this Bill C-68, there's provisions for ecologically sensitive areas. And you may recall that there's it's called a scallop ground buffer zone that is in the area where the Northern Pulp would like to extend its pipe. And those areas are being counted towards Canada's 10% protection. Right now, they only regulate fishing activity. Fishermen have put them forward. There's no scallop fishing, protects lobster, bunch of other species at risk, listed and non-listed, right? So there's a few things that I think if those areas were designated as ecologically sensitive areas, then the minister could make a decision that a new activity going through that may be a harmful alteration or destruction of fish habitat would not be permitted.
That's the Minister of Fisheries or the Minister of the
Fisheries could
Environment?
do that under C-68. As I understand it, it has not yet been applied because the C-68 has to go through. This issue seems to be punted back and forth. Nobody wants to deal with it. It's a hot potato. I do think that the Minister of Fisheries could also say we think that this activity, does alter fish habitat. I think that could happen, but it is being until there's a federal EA. But in the SIA 2012, they removed the Fisheries Act triggers, right? So it makes it a little bit more difficult. But Environment Canada and Climate Change Canada could say that under Section 36 that the effluent is a deleterious substance and not authorize it. So there's a few ways of getting to it. I think there's also ways of centrifuging out all of the flocculent matter and reducing the temperature of the water. There's other things the private sector could do. Personally, I think the pipe is, the amount of flocculant that will go into the Northumberland Strait, given the other issues that are going on in Northumberland Strait, including it being one of the fastest warming bodies of water in Canada, it's too much, right? And there's so many species in the Southern Gulf, including cod and thorny skate and American plaice that are in very bad shape. It's usually we lose fish by death through 1,000 cuts, and I would say this is like a potentially big one.
Cut.
But it's punted right now, right?
Is there anything we could put in this bill that would, or you think there's provisions in this bill that would allow the Minister of Fisheries to act?
I'm not a lawyer. I'm a scientist, but I do feel that the ecologically sensitive areas provisions could be used. I do feel
Already
that.
being used to protect scallops.
No, this bill would have to go through, and then you would declare the scallop ground buffer zones as ecologically sensitive areas to count towards our 10%, and you would have to make sure that other activities are not impacting the intent of those areas, which the pipe could be seen as doing. You could ask that question to the minister again, might be a good idea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And thank you, Senator Duffy. And I want to thank our senators. It's been a long evening, but certainly we had some great discussion and debate. I want to thank our witnesses. And certainly, as I said to other witnesses, if there's something that you think that after you leave today that you may have forgot to mention when you were here, feel free to send it to our clerk as a part of our deliberations as we go forward on the bill. But once again, I want to thank you for your time this evening and certainly for presenting remarks and recommendations, amendments, possible amendments that you put forward. So, that, folks, we're adjourned.